the director of the Center for Africana Studies here at University of Pennsylvania. And this event is the first conversation in our spring semester faculty research colloquium. And the center is delighted today to put the spotlight on philosophy and race. And our speakers, Quayshawn Spencer and Chike Jeffers, are going to address the question, what is race? Quayshawn Spencer is the Robert S. Blank Presidential Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, and philosophy of race. His work has appeared in a wide range of philosophy journals such as Philosophy of Science and Philosophical Studies. His research has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the American Philosophical Association. He is the co-author of What is Race? Four Philosophical Views, Oxford University Press, and he is the editor of The Race Debates, From Metaphysics to Medicine, forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Chike Jeffers is an associate professor of philosophy at Dalhousie University. He specializes in Africana philosophy and philosophy of race with broad interests in social and political philosophy and ethics. He co-authored What is Race? Four Philosophical Views with Quayshawn Spencer as well as Sally Haslinger and Joseph Glasgow. He is currently working on a book-length introduction to W.E.B. Du Bois as a philosopher. He has also co-authored with Peter Adamson of the scripted episodes of a podcast, The History of Africana Philosophy, a part of the larger series, A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Without any more delay, let the conversation begin. Welcome, Quayshawn Spencer and Chike Jeffers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Could I share my screen? All right. Well, thank you for inviting us and allowing us to exercise some intellectual brain cells in this time of what is, at least for me, mostly being a overpaid daycare worker since my kids are at home most of the time. But so what I hope to do is to give a just rough summary of my contribution to this book that Chike, Sally, and Josh Glasgow and that's it, wrote, called What is Race? And instead of like diving deep into my contribution into the book, I'm going to kind of like summarize that and more talk about the background to the philosophical debate that we're engaging in. At least I'm engaging in. Chike is free to disagree, and a little bit of the background philosophy that I'm adopting to defend the position that I'm defending, and then I'll summarize my contribution. So, in philosophy of race, we're a weird crowd insofar as we actually are debating about what is race. I know in other parts of academia, like critical race theory, it's pretty much settled, some kind of social construct, but we're a little bit more cantankerous, let's say. And just to be a little bit more precise, one of the biggest debates that philosophers of race are engaged in is something I call the U.S. race debate. And of course, there are not everyone is just concerned with this, as Chike is probably going to clarify. But basically, I'll say this is the debate whereby all of the dominant ways that we use race and race terms are classifying people in ordinary and current American English. And a natural sort of question arises after looking at this phenomenon of our race talk. Well, what is race? And what is the reality of race, if race is real, right? And I'll just say for clarity's sake, a U.S. race theory is an account that gives the nature and reality of race in this linguistic context. Now, for the particular debate I'm engaging in philosophy, some of the biggest original contributors are Anthony Appia, who's now, I believe, at NYU, and was one of Chike's advisors, I believe, Lucius Outlaw, and Naomi Zach. And the dialectic, how it unfolded, was actually Appia came on the scene and was arguing that race is a biological thing and not real. He has a book in both race theory and Africana philosophy from 1992, which makes that case. And other people like Lawrence Blum and Josh Glasgow, first edition, made a contribution similar to that. And then came along folks arguing that race is biological and real. Lucius Outlaw was one of the first in philosophy of race to do that. And he actually had a nuanced view. It was like a biosocial thing in real, but nonetheless, it was biological. And then came the army of social constructionists. Zach actually uh, claims that this was her contribution, even though people read her in a slightly different respect as a biological anti-realist, but she was claiming that she was more than that. She was actually arguing for something a little bit more substantive. But in any case, there's a lot of activity here. We are arguing that race is not biological, but nevertheless real, and a lot of social constructionists are in here. Last but not least, I guess for logical completeness, you could say that race is not a biological thing and not real. However, I haven't seen anyone publish on that. So if there are graduate students in the audience that would like to get started on some uncharted territory, I would recommend number 4 here. So an example of some of the work that we do, this is one of the most recent books. Of course, our book is a little bit more recent. This one's called Rethinking Race from Michael Hardiman. He's a philosopher of race at UCSD. And he argues for a biological account of race as biological in American English, as well as being real, biologically real. And he has these 3 criteria. Basically, races are these visible groups from certain kinds of visible features that are ancestrally linked to a certain geographic home. He claims that there are various examples of these races in our society, like the Office of Management Budget races, which I actually focus on a lot in the book. And he claims that this race that we talk about is biologically real. He calls this the minimalist race, by the way. All right. So the background philosophy of language that folks kind of need to understand what's going on in the book as well is the following. There's some discussion, especially between me, Josh, and Sally, about the appropriate way to think about the meaning of a name. And here, I'm including both proper names, like a term that picks out a particular thing, like Barack Obama, as well as common names that picks out classes of things. The most popular way of thinking about meanings of names is what's called truth conditional meanings. It's largely because this survey that I'm getting this from is dominated by analytic philosophers, but nonetheless, philosophy of language is an outgrowth of analytic philosophy. And in this paradigm of thinking about meaning, and that is popular for thinking about name meanings, is that a name is that which constitutes a word's contribution to the truth conditions of the propositions in which occurs. So you look at the expressions that we use the term, and we see what it is that we're sort of substituting for the term, so to speak, to get the appropriate truth values in the right situations. When the thing that contributes to truth values is the referent, this is a view that we call referentialism in the philosophy of language literature. And when we think it's the reference fixing descriptions, it's something we call descriptivism. Now, in the book, Sally Haslanger is a very staunch supporter of referential semantics for names. And Josh Glasgow is a very strong supporter of descriptivist semantics for names. I'm more of I think more of an engineering perspective. Whatever works, go with that. I just happen to think that referential semantics works for certain race, certain terms in our language, certain uses of race, and certain race terms. All right, but to give a better sort of introduction to this distinction, um, here's an example. Take the name Sasha. What does Sasha mean? Well, from a descriptivist point of view, you might throw out a definition like the second born child of Barack and Michelle Obama. From a referentialist point of view, they just point to the objects in the world, and that's the meaning, right? So I remember sort of sharing these two views to a group of scientists at a conference in California once, and they were just stunned that philosophers were thinking that meanings were things in the world like this instead of just descriptions. But lo and behold, yes, there are these two views. All right, who's right? Um, Officially, if you're adopting a truth conditional view of meaning, it depends on who gets the truth values of the relevant propositions right that are using the name, right? So here's an example of where referentialism might be getting the story correct. Uh, Take Michelle Obama's book Becoming, where she talks about her unfortunate miscarriage, which happened before she had her first child. Malia's her first child. Um, in that case, Malia could have been the second born child of Barack and Michelle Obama in the world where the child that she miscarried in this world actually ended up being born. So we can generate this sort of test proposition to see how Barack and Michelle actually intend to assign meaning to the name Sasha. Um, Malia could have been Sasha. Is that true or not? You see the challenge here. Well, um, if the answer is no, and presumably it is no, then we'd say that descriptivism fails, and it would fail because philosophers of language would say in certain cases, when we're assigning name meanings, we're rigidly designating the name. So the thing that we're picking out is intended to be the same thing in all possible scenarios in which the name picks out something. But referential semantics isn't always the preferred go-to for figuring out a name's meaning. I like a lot of history of science, so here's an example I sometimes use in my philosophy of science courses. Consider the name Vulcan. What does Vulcan mean? Well, this was a name that was thrown out by Urbain Le Verrier, who was a 1800s astronomer who used Newtonian mechanics to actually identify a new planet Neptune and became famous for that. From problems understanding the orbit of Uranus, and we had some problems understanding the orbit of Mercury, and so he proposed this new planet Vulcan, which is supposed to be the circumsolar planet closer than Mercury, right? From a descriptive point of view, that would seem to be a lovely definition because, of course, we didn't find Vulcan. There's nothing there. From a referentialist point of view, however, the meaning then becomes nothing. All right. So, who's got the right meaning in this context? Consider another historical example like Jemuel from Charles Darwin. That was identified to have no reference as well from meticulous work in the study of heredity. We don't talk about Darwin's failures as much as his accomplishments, but there's nothing that's picked out by that term. So we have another test proposition. Vulcan is the same thing as Jemuel. Is that sentence true? It's like, wow, given how these scientists intended to use these names, presumably this isn't true, in which case referentialism would be a poor semantic model for understanding these names' meanings. So we say that in cases where we don't have reference for the names, typically descriptivism is a more powerful, accurate theory of meaning. Okay. So with respect to my contribution to the book, um, I have a couple theses in the book. In chapter 3, I roll out uh, a use of referential semantics to pinpoint the meaning of what I think is a dominant use of race in ordinary American English, um, uh, OMB race talk. And I think that OMB race talk, the race talk that's used by the federal government in lots of cases, actually picks out a biological thing and it's real. However, I don't take that to exhaust what I think race is, and together with some what I think are relatively straightforward true auxiliary assumptions, you can get this bigger view, which is my real view, which is radical racial pluralism. And what that is that what race is and whether it's real has multiple answers depending on context. There's no single thing. An example, just by combining two race theories in the literature to give a better view of what radical racial realism would be, radical racial pluralism. One of my co-authors, Sally Haslanger, has this view that race in our race talk is a racialized group in real. I already talked about Michael Hardiman's view. It's a biological account of race and it's real. And so my view would say, well, in a certain context, Haslanger is right that race is a racialized group in real. And in another context, Michael Hardiman would be right. Those contexts aren't the same, and the things you're saying race aren't the same. Right? So that's how you can get a simple account. I'm not saying that they are. This is part of the right race theory, but I'm just saying that this is one way to understand it. Now, with respect to the argument I deploy in the book, in chapter 7, I say that, well, if there's more than one meaning of race in U.S. race talk, then you've got radical racial pluralism holding for U.S. race talk. The OMB's meaning of race is one meaning of race in U.S. race talk in chapter 3. The OMB's meaning of race is a biological thing, namely a biological population subdivision of humans that I call the human continental populations. And however, this isn't the only meaning of race that we use in U.S. race talk, which I was referring to as a trivially true assumption. And then you get radical racial pluralism at the end of the my contribution. So the big picture is, if you were to contrast it with, Appia has this famous phrase in philosophy of race literature, the truth is that there are no races. There is nothing in the world that can do all we ask race to do for us. My big picture would be, the truth is race is a plurality of things, and no non-contextualized statement about whether races exist has a determinable truth value. So thank you very much. Book is available now. Now we'll see exactly how I'm wrong by my illustrious co-author, Chike Jeffers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Quayshawn, and thank you for the slides. I don't have slides, so it's going to be even more informal in terms of this initial contribution of mine. But I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we'll have. So I do want to begin. I thought it might be most interesting to begin by talking about how in the book I criticize Quayshawn's view. And I am going to be focusing on the biological realism that is a component of his broader view of radical racial pluralism. So one thing that I argue is that biological realism about race faces a dilemma. Either the way of arguing that there are biologically real races among humans is so distinct and removed from what we are talking about when we talk about race as a part of the social landscape. Either those are so different that it becomes, in fact, confusing to use the term race, because you're going to end up making people think that you're saying something relevant to their social lives, but you're not. Or, let me hold on to the or, because I want to give an example of what I'm calling the first problem there. So there's philosopher Robin Andreasen, and in some of Quayshawn's earlier work, he criticized Andreasen. She's a biological realist about race. She thinks that we can use certain genetic data to reconstruct the sort of the tree of humanity. That is to say, the different ways that populations branched off over time, over the course of our history as a species. And that we can think of the branches on that tree as different races. That's a very schematic picture of her view. And she thinks that the fact that when we're talking about race as a social matter, that may be sort of far removed from what she's talking about. She thinks that's fine, that, biologists can focus on race as a biological subspecific difference, that is, groups within the species, right? That biologists can focus on that. Sociologists, can focus on the social stuff. And it's just a division of labor. You have these two different things. So actually, I think that it is a strength of the biological realism that Quayshawn puts forward in our book, that it doesn't go that way. Because I'm suggesting, firstly, there's many ways that people have criticized Andreassen's view. As I said, Quayshawn's own work shows that. But specifically, I'm suggesting that that's one problematic way that biological realism can go, because the more you say that, like, well, these are just totally different topics, then the more, again, you're going to risk confusion when scientists try to speak about race in the public sphere. So I like that by talking about the US Census categories and how it seems like we can, according to Quayshawn, find the biologically real populations, these human continental populations, and realize that actually these are one and the same, right? Then you have no problem there of the biological realist going off in a direction that can confuse people, because in fact he's saying, well, here's this biologically real thing that we actually deal with socially all the time, right? Because an important point that Quayshawn is making is, people obviously engage in what he calls OMB race talk, right? OMB for the Office of Management and Budget, I believe. People engage in that all the time because they, identify on forms for jobs and admissions into universities and so on and so on and so on. So in that regard, there is a clear social relevance to what he is saying turns out to be biologically real. So it's very tantalizing in that sense. The argument that I push against that biological realism, which has become a sort of standard way of trying to rebut biological realism, is what's called the mismatch objection. And so this is the idea that when you try to, get these biologically respectable groups that you can call races, right, as opposed to older ways of thinking of race as biological, right? What we tend to call, traditional biological essentialism, classical racialism is another term for it. The idea that, so the old way of thinking of race as biologically real is that, you have these races that are made distinct not only by appearance, but also by underlying, non-physical characteristics. And so races have different intellectual, behavioral, moral tendencies, right? This is, of course, something that's still part of, you know, how people often think today, right? You know, they think that, you know, it's just natural that Black people can dance well. It's just natural that, you know, East Asians can do, you know, math well. And so that's classical racialism, right? And it's important not to mix up the kind of biological realism that Quayshawn and others support with that. But the problem, many of us who are not biological realists argue, is that as soon as you, you know, get away from this old classical racialist, biological essentialist way of thinking, and you start talking about, you know, just the kinds of populations that population geneticists can pick out through their research, then you start to deviate from how we generally understand the divisions between racial groups in ways that suggest that we'd be better off not calling those races, right? So in other words, it does, again, sort of get down to the idea that it's going to be just confusing to call that which we can maybe agree is biologically real. It's going to be confusing to call that races, right? So the major example that, or thought experiment that I used in my first chapter of the book is I asked, you know, the reader to imagine a woman in England of Bangladeshi parentage. She's dark-skinned. So, you know, does it make sense to tell her, you know, you think you're racially different from the majority, you know, in the UK, but as a matter of fact, no, you're actually both part of this rather broad racial group of Caucasians or Caucasoids, or, you know, these are some of the the names that we might have that are used in some of the population geneticist literature, right? And this is something that, you know, in his first article propounding his view, you know, Quayshawn faced up to that he had found quite a match, he felt, between, you know, the census categories and the human continental populations, right? But he admitted, you know, one discrepancy would be that the census categories say that South Asians are in the Asian American category, whereas by and large, they are in the Caucasian category of these human continental populations. And we can, you know, talk about how these populations have been seen to be distinct by population geneticists during the Q&A if people want more information about that. So, as you can imagine, part of where I'm going when I ask us to imagine telling this young woman, you know, that, well, by the way, you're confused, you're not racially different, right? Is that it would, you know, sort of be a bit nonsense from the perspective of her lived experience, at least. The idea that she's, no, you're racially part of the majority, right? And something that I didn't mention in the book, but I think is actually worth mentioning here about why I even chose that example, especially because, you know, we're in an Africana studies context right now, is that there is this interesting history, particularly in the UK, is where I would say it's been most prominent. This history in the UK of sometimes using the term Black in a broad way such that it covers people of recent African descent and also specifically South Asians. And that people sometimes exaggerate how much of a role in UK race talk that is. you know, based on my understanding, you know, it's never something that was like, you know, to make the point that Quayshawn made, you know, there would be context in which people would be invoking this idea that Black people is made up of those both of those branches, and context in which people would either contest that or not use that way of speaking. Um, but you can sort of see then why I would want to use that example, right, of, you know, someone who, by many people's um, classifications, at least at certain points, at least let's say in the 70s and 80s, if not now, you know, she would count as Black, and then the funniness of then thinking, actually no, she should count as, you know, the same as the white majority, right? And then actually, to just broaden that point a little bit more, when you then read some of the luminaries of the Africana tradition, and I'm thinking here especially of Stephen Biko in South Africa, and also Walter Rodney in Guyana, which is actually the place of my mother's birth. There are times that they are in fact arguing for a broad understanding of Black, where it will also include South Asians, and so again, that's always been controversial, and so I don't want to naturalize that and say, well, like, everybody should start calling South Asians Black. But nevertheless, the fact that that's an important part of our history of Black South Asian relations, the question of whether Black is a term that counts for all of us, I think sort of highlights why I make the point that way. Also, as is sort of obvious from what I've just said, I totally don't take myself to be engaging in just a US race debate. For me, the race debate is a global affair, and that's how I understand it. The other quick correction that I would make is that Appia was not one of my advisors. You might have been thinking of Charles Mills. But yeah, so that's sort of how I press the mismatch objection against Quayshawn. But then another interesting way that I try and say why I disagree with his view is with a thought experiment in the second of my two chapters, where I say, imagine that Quayshawn was just like so big that, you know, like everyone in government started agreeing with him, and like in the schools, they just started teaching Quayshawn all the time, so that like people just, you know, they were like, okay, you know, whatever he says in his chapter, that's pretty much, that's the word on race, right? So, you know, in this thought experiment, then the mismatch would go away, right? So those who were South Asian, you know, would no longer well, actually, let me not use the South Asian example. For the purposes of making this point, I'll use the example of Arab Americans, right? So there are times that Arab Americans will identify, let's say in everyday context, as racially distinct. This is not so much the case when they're filling out forms, as Quayshawn shows, and that's because the forms, you know, if you're paying attention to what it says, it literally tells you if you're, you know, from the Middle East, North Africa, to identify as white. But you know, if we imagine, right, you know, I would want to say that there is a mismatch there, that you're missing out on how a lot of Arab Americans experience racial difference, right? If you just sort of take that bureaucratic point that they check the right box as decisive. But in this thought experiment where, you know, everybody listens to Quayshawn and we just, you know, think, okay, what are races? Well, they're these biologically real things, these human continental populations, right? So now the Arab Americans are going to be like, oh, well, yeah, I'm just obviously white, right? So what I'm suggesting is, if we imagine this world in which there's no more mismatches, in which basically what's got social currency actually does map on to this biological thing, the human continental populations, with no mismatches, what am I going to say about that? Well, I would say that, ironically, what's going on there actually would further confirm my distance from biological realism. Why? Because of the contingency of the match, so to speak, right? In other words, the only reason that we would be impressed then by how much the biological and the social is matching up is precisely because of the privileged place of the social, right? And if things then happen, if Quayshawn goes out of favor and someone else starts propounding another racial view that really doesn't match up, with these human continental populations, and then that takes over, right? Then we'll see what really matters. What matters is the social, right? Um, so that's a bit about how I criticize Quayshawn's view. I will much more quickly say a little bit about my own view, because I don't want to take up too much time before we get to Q&A. So what you can sort of already tell from the way that I criticize Quayshawn is that I think social constructionism makes the most sense out of how talk of race factors into our public discourse. But there is this question that I then raise, um, of a distinction between two types of social constructionism, right? And you can sort of get into thinking about how there are these two different types by asking, well, okay, if we say races are socially constructed, well, socially constructed out of what? Right? What is the social stuff that is making race real? And so I distinguish between political constructionism and cultural constructionism. And political constructionism says that the stuff that out of which race is constructed is relations of power, right? Differential relations of power, hierarchies, right? Um, and that's what race is. So I also at one point, sort of spell out that view, which is not my view. I'm a cultural constructionist, but I spell out the political constructionist view more by saying, a maximally robust political constructionism holds at least three things: that these differential relations of power is the origin of race. Two, that it's what's most important at the present in present about race. So in other words, if you're trying to understand race, you definitely have to understand the relations of power, and there's nothing else that you have to understand, is one way to think about that point. And then third, the differential relations of power are essential, which would mean that if they go away, that is, for example, if equality between peoples comes about, then you actually will not have race anymore. And I don't call myself a political constructionist. I do call myself a cultural constructionist. Is that because I hold a maximally robust cultural constructionism, right? According to which, let's say differences in ways of life would be the origin, what's most important, and what's essential. So no, I don't actually hold that, right? But I do disagree with political constructionism in a way that makes cultural constructionist a good label. So I'll explain that by contrasting my view with the maximally robust political constructionism, right? And the first point of contrast is not, in fact, a point of contrast, but a point of agreement. So I concede the first point, that is, that differential relations of power are the origin of race as we know it, right? In other words, I agree with, what many people think, namely that European imperialism, the slave trade, the expropriation of indigenous land in the Americas, that these are the things that sort of bring race as we know it into being, right? But then it's important to me that as soon as you have these categories, these racial categories, and as soon as you have people being born into inhabiting these categories, right, that there is cultural significance to racial identity that is equally important. And so I disagree with the idea that relations of power are what is most important. You know, I say that the relations of power and the inhabiting of ways of life, you know, identifications with differing ways of interacting and understanding the world. I argue that those are equally important. Right? And to give a very quick example, you take something like understanding racism in education. Right? You can partly understand that by looking at, you know, okay, who's getting uh, which schools are getting better funding, which students are being kicked out more often, right? You know, you can look at it in a bunch of ways that really do sort of reduce, you might say, to relations of power, right? Disadvantage, privilege. But on the other hand, you won't really understand what those of us who are concerned with racism in education are going on about if you don't understand something like Eurocentrism, right? The privileging of European um, history, thought, culture, right? Over that which is emerging culturally out of different populations, right? You won't understand the problem of racism in education unless you pay attention to that cultural side of things. So I'll just use that as an example. And I, beyond disagreeing that the relations of power is what is most important above the cultural, I also deny that the relations of power is essential. So against the political constructionist idea that if we get past racism, then really we won't even have anything like race anymore, I argue that no, racism could die and racial identities as cultural identities could live on, right, in relative equality, so to speak. Furthermore, I think that's an important goal. So, in other words, um, one of the best reasons to call me a cultural constructionist is because what I uh, think we should be doing is continuing to construct races as cultural groups, right? So, for example, I am personally invested in the ongoing development of the Black race, right? As a cultural reality, while seeking to end, um, you know, differences between races at the level of hierarchy and relations of power. So that is a summary of my view, and I'm glad that we've been able to break that down a little bit, and I look forward to our further discussion.
Thank you so much, Quayshawn Spencer and Chike Jeffers. I greatly look forward to teaching this book, What is Race? And we do indeed have questions. So the first question posed by your audience: can you first define biological realism? And this question was posed early on, Chike, in your presentation. So I'm wondering, it could be that the person who posed this question feels that you have already answered it, but I still want to put it out there. If either of you want to say more about what you really mean at the nitty-gritty level in terms of biological realism.
I mean, the quick thing that I'll say, and Quayshawn can add anything he wants, is that you know, biological realism simply means races are real, and what they are is fundamentally, or in some sense, most importantly, biological.
Yeah, I'm not gonna add too much to that. I do think that the whoever asked that question is picking up on an interesting ambiguity in the literature, because that's how I introduced it. What race is biological and it's real. But also you see in the literature, sort of a biologically real sort of interpretation of biological realism. For example, Josh Glasgow has another book, A Theory of Race, where he says that biological realism is the view that race is biologically real. But notice that that is compatible with race not having a biological sort of constitution, sort of essence, and satisfying this other property of being biologically real. So that's actually a good question because there is ambiguity in literature. But insofar as what we're engaging with in the book, race is a biological thing and it's real.
Okay, so the next question from your audience, how would you respond to the idea that not everybody has a race, i.e. racial ambiguity?
I'll take the first go because I actually have an essay that a paper that I worked on over the years, and I'm actually going to present it on Friday. This is to McMaster University in Ontario, and racial ambiguity is actually a central topic in that paper. So just to, I guess, give an example of other things I think about and to sort of answer the question at the same time, hopefully, right? What I'm exploring in that paper is the question of racial voluntarism. What is racial voluntarism? The idea that what race you are could be up to you. That so voluntarism involves what is dependent upon the will of somebody, right? And so can you just choose to be what race you are, right? Most people would think that generally doesn't make any sense, and I don't support an unconstrained racial voluntarism. I think in general, it's not the case that you get to decide, right? But what I argue in that paper is that it does actually make sense for social constructionists to recognize racial voluntarism in cases of racial ambiguity. And let me just give a very quick example of that. So I think Barack Obama is Black, right? I know I'm coming out with controversial opinions here, right? But why? Why should I say why should I believe that Barack Obama is Black? Should I believe that because he looks Black? Should I believe that because we know he has a Black African father? Right? So I think actually crucially in the case of Barack Obama, the fact that he self-identifies as Black is meaningful here. Naomi Zak, actually, a philosopher mentioned by Quayshawn, has expressed in a philosophical paper a view that has also been expressed by some that some were actually disappointed with the way that Barack Obama filled out the census, because he had the opportunity, if he wanted, to identify as being of more than one race, given that he is mixed, Black and white. Right? He chose to identify solely as Black. And we know that there's a reason why, that we know that there's a standard discourse that he is continuing to engage in by doing that. And then, you can choose whether to be disappointed in that or not, or whether to think it's something, in fact, good that Obama identifies in that way. But my argument in that paper is that in a case where the classification of mixed race identities has become a little murky, right, then there's a certain ambiguity there. And I think that a person's self-identification can help remove that ambiguity. Does that mean that there are people who have no race? Because that was another part of the question. And I'm not sure that is possible. In other words, for any case where it's unclear what a person's race would be, because there's different possible answers, either because of the mixed race thing or another way that you can have ambiguity is because we're not sure how to divide up the world, right? Are Arabs white? Are Central Asians the same race as East Asians, at least if they have a certain appearance, right? Something that Quayshawn and I both talk about in the book is Melanesians. That is people in places like Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, right? Often very hard to distinguish in appearance from sub-Saharan Africans, right? So are they part of the Black race, right? So when you get these, when you get ambiguity, right, either because of mixed race stuff or how do we divide up the world, then I think actually self-identification can help resolve that. But I don't know that racial ambiguity can mean that someone doesn't have a race, right? Because once we ask, well, where are your parents from? It's going to lead towards some possible answers, is my thought. But let me hand it over to Quayshawn.
Good. I, as a pluralist, I'm going to come at this from a pluralist perspective. So there's going to be, for me, two different kinds of racial ambiguity. One, where we're understanding ambiguity is literally the quality of being open to more than one interpretation. One, you can have multiple reasonable interpretations semantically, right? So you could be ambiguous with respect to what you count as in terms of your race in one context is different from what you count as in terms of your race in another context, right? So, for example, in I argue the OMB context, it's about your ancestry. In another context, Josh Glasgow argues that uh, it's visible physical trait groupings are races. So the same person in different linguistic contexts could be raised differently, and that could be what's constituting the ambiguity. And I'll just draw upon Chike's example of Melanesians. He actually was the one that sent me this video about Fijian Americans, which is the most populous group of Melanesians in the United States, being interviewed by the media about being treated as black. Like nobody knows they're black, right? So I'm sorry, nobody knows that they're Melanesian, but they're being treated as black.
Right, right.
And so, I mean, you can imagine someone who looks exactly like me but has a very different ancestry. Um, the police aren't going to ask for your 23andMe report before they start treating you a certain way, right? So, in that sense, it would be ambiguous what your race is because of a difference in a linguistic context. But there's another type where even in the same context, the same person can be ambiguous, and the context will determine what how that ambiguity gets realized. So, say that we're in a context where social constructionism, like a racialized group account, is robust. Then it's about how other people are perceiving you at some deep level. Well, people could perceive you this differently at the same time. So you can have like synchronic multiracialism, which gets pretty ambiguous. Or you can have like a diachronic multiracialism where at different points in your life, people perceive you differently, right? So if you saw a picture of my first picture from birth, you'd say, that's a Native American kid because I had straight hair, I was white skinned, I look very different. So there's different sorts of I think racial ambiguities that one could bring to bear to answer this question from a pluralist perspective. The is Can anyone be racist is an interesting question. Lots of philosophers of race think not. Appia argued for that. Chike thinks that's not the case. I'm leaving it as an open empirical question. That's what I'll say.
We have time for one more question. Using the conception distinction that is popular in a lot of philosophical discourse, is there a concept of race that you two agree on that anchors your debate so that you are not talking past one another? If so, what is that shared concept? And is that the concept shared by your other co-authors of the book, What is Race?
Quayshawn, let me ask you to say something about that first.
Yeah, so the conception distinction, that's something that Rawls made famous, but other philosophers have articulated before. The problem, depending on what's meant by a concept, typically that's taking on descriptivist semantic assumptions, insofar as the content of the concept are some reference fixing descriptions. But if you take a wider view of a concept, then maybe there's some referential thing that we're all agreeing on. I'm not sure. I actually don't think that's the source of the agreement among philosophers of race when we're arguing about what is race. I take an approach that's more inspired by Paul Taylor in this book, Race: An Introduction, where he argues that sort of the foundational thing that we're all recognizing is race talk. And these is some kind of language games. We're deploying the term race and race terms, Asian, black, white, and so forth. And the project then becomes, well, what is it that we're talking about when we're engaging in those language games, right? So the thing that we'll be agreeing on is this discourse that we could observe just from the linguistic constituents, right? RACE, right? Picking out people, stuff like that. um, and then that would be the anchor from my point of view, and that's how you can sort of end up disagreeing about the essence of the thing race, because it's a good question, because if you don't, then you are talking past each other. If you don't, if there isn't something that you're sort of anchoring yourself to, then you're just fooling yourself and thinking that you're disagreeing. Since Chike is a big fan of Paul Taylor, I don't think he disagreed too strongly with what I just said there.
That's true. I don't. And in fact, the maybe hopefully okay, but sneaky thing I want to do is, because I feel bad about maybe talking too long, I want to see if I can say a real quick thing about another question that I saw in there, because I think that Quayshawn really addressed the conception question well. Because someone asked specifically regarding my view, is there a Black cultural race? What are some of the cultural artifacts that tie together all members of the Black race? Right? And it's the kind of thing where someone might wonder, is my view suggesting that, like, well, we're all Black because we all eat this one food, right? I mean, and then it's gonna be like, which food is that? Obviously, that would be ridiculous, right? Really, what ties together Blackness as a culture, right, is going to be identification as Black, um, identification with Africa as place of origin, right? And the idea that that is somehow meaningful, right? And if that sounds thin, you know, I mean, it's to me, it's how culture works, right? And you might notice, for example, what ties America together culturally, right? I mean, there's so much cultural diversity, in the United States of America. And anytime you take a broad category, right, you can also go to the question of Western culture, right? Now we've got Americans and a whole bunch of other people in it, right? And so the more you think that culture is going to be like a very specific list of customs, then once you get to broad categories, culture is not going to make sense, right? But if you do believe, right, that there can be culturally American, you know, experiences, or that Western culture, for example, as a broad category, can potentially be meaningful, then you're going to be open to what I'm talking about when I'm saying that for those of us for whom it is meaningful that we're Black, right, and that we see ourselves in a certain historical story, right, involving not just human beings existing in sub-Saharan Africa, but also being dispersed into various places through such events as the slave trade, and that broad history being relevant to how we understand ourselves and how we place ourselves, in a history, right? And for me, in terms of identifying as Black, it's not like me as a Canadian. So, I'm Black and what matters is Blackness in Canada. Well, no, that also already wouldn't make sense because I'm of West Indian parentage. So first of all, then I'd have to get into Caribbean. But I'm also very influenced by, African American culture. I named my kids African names. Mainly West African names, right? Like so clearly, there's not just one little bit of that broad scope that makes me culturally Black. My cultural Blackness is an attachment to a much broader story. So hopefully that's sort of a start of an answer to the question. Thank you all so much for having us. This has really been great.
Thank you so much, Quayshawn
Yeah,
Spencer
thank you.
and Chike Jeffers. Let me say again that this book, What is Race? 4 Philosophical Views, needs to be widely read and widely taught. Good evening, everyone. And please check out the Center for Africana Studies website in order to get the full details of our future events. Thank you both so much.